Welcome, everybody, to this session hosted by the Global South Women's Forum on Sustainable Development. Before we begin, a couple of virtual housekeeping announcements. This session provides interpretation. Please go to interpretation if you are listening to an audio interpretation to choose your language channel. You should only need to remain in the language channel of your choice at all times. Please mute original audio to only hear the interpreter. This session is also offering Nepali Sign Language interpretation. Welcome again. To maximize the bandwidth for all participants, please turn off your videos at all times unless you are the speaker. To also reduce interference and background noise, we kindly request that you mute your microphones at all times unless you are the speaker. If you're experiencing slow bandwidth, please close any unnecessary programs on your computer that is taking up the bandwidth. We will be using the chat box publicly to engage with one another. Please be reminded that this session is being live streamed and the recording will remain public on the ERA Asia Pacific YouTube channel. We are very committed to ensuring that this space is inclusive and safe, and we will encourage you to be respectful and to avoid replicating societal prejudices and inequalities. Participants who engage in such disruptive behavior may be removed without prior notice. As such, we're very honored that you're joining us, and we're handing this now over to the session organizers.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. I'm Preeti Daruka. I'm the co-founder of BRICS Feminists Watch and the executive director of PUSER International. BRICS Feminists Watch, in partnership with South Center, Third World Network, Inequality Movement, Espacio Feminista, and PUSER is happy to host this session titled South Feminist Organizing, Promoting Accountability and Gender Justice in the Sustainable Finance and Investment Dimensions of South-South Cooperation. First of all, a big thank you to IRA and the amazing work that they have done in organizing this fabulous Global South Women's Forum. So as we unpack macroeconomics, there are various institutes and spaces that we need to look at. To start with, let's look at the International Financial Institutes, or IFI, including IMF, World Bank, and the new regional banks such as AIIB, NDB. These IFIs have considerable power in framing and implementing the global financial systems and governance. The neoliberal orientation of these institutions, their policies, and their programmatic requirements, including the conditionality that they devise, help shape global rule setting and the design of national level policy and practices. These impact millions of lives in developing economies in the global south. BRICS, which include Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, emerged on the global landscape as a new bloc of emerging economies in the aftermath of 2008 global financial crisis. BRICS is seen as an emergence of shifts in economic power and as a step towards constructing a multipolar world. It has grown in terms of significance and power. These countries boast of enormous political clout in their respective regions, not just in their country, but also in the region, in international arena, and all 5 countries being members of G20 group of countries also. However, BRICS has elicited criticism for being driven by the same market-oriented impulses as other multilateral bodies. BRICS focus areas of trade, investment, renewable energy, infrastructure, agriculture, science, technology, innovation, financial cooperation, connectivity, ICT, etc., etc., have important implications for day-to-day lives of women and men in BRICS countries and other regions too. Despite all these problems, limitations, and paradoxes, BRICS does create opportunities for greater autonomy and self-determination in a scenario still very much dominated by United States and its allies. The West capitalist model, with limitless wealth accumulation based on conquest, colonization, industrialization, production, and consumerism, is undergoing changes and has been in crisis for some time. Free market competition with state control of people, knowledge, resources, with use of military power has increased inequalities and left many behind. BRICS' apparent goal based on South-South cooperation is to push for a collective agenda to open spaces in which they can pose relevant issues while strengthening one another. Unlike aid from traditional donors, BRICS, excluding Russia, views their financing as primarily based on principle of South-South cooperation. This positioning of development cooperation by BRICS has helped push for a new kind of international development cooperation, whereby development partners affirm that they respect state sovereignty and merely assist in building capacity of countries to realize their own development path. These developments have also opened spaces and opportunity for feminist activists from the South to engage with the larger political economic debates. How to move out of this neoliberal model of open market competitiveness to build economies based on
Priti,
cooperation
this
with...
is Rachel. I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but you are speaking very, very fast, especially because you're reading of something. Can I request that you go slower for
Okay,
the
I will.
interpreters so that all our
Sorry.
participants can understand us? Please
Sure.
also sit back a little bit more because you're leaning too close. Thank you so much. I'm really sorry to interrupt
No, thanks,
you.
Rachel, for pointing out. So, how to move out of this neoliberal model of open market and competitiveness to build economies based on cooperation with re-established state obligations for the well-being of its people grounded in human rights. These development and negotiation also point to the need for a feminist agenda to clearly draw up a South perspective for their analysis and perspective. To explore these ideas, BRICS Feminist Watch was formed as a Global South Feminist Alliance. The watch brings the collective strength of feminist analysis and activism to provide alternative to dominant economic reasoning that particularly benefits women. There is an opportunity for feminists to explore how to bring to the core of these emerging new development a strong economic reasoning and the concept of economic justice to support lower end of production, including small farms and firms, and how to demand decent work that recognizes women as workers and is inclusive of the concept of unpaid work that women do. As South feminists, we aspire to claim these new spaces, opportunities, to put forward ideas as it relates to women's work, labor, productive resources, including natural resources, land, water, and bodily integrity in formulating economic and development policies. We also aim to modify and or reject north-based agendas. To guide us through this conversation and mutual learning today, we have a number of very impressive speakers who have approached these issues from diverse perspectives. We are going to cast a very wide net.
Priti, I'm really sorry to interrupt you again, but the interpreters are all telling me now again that you're speaking still really fast.
Okay, I'll
So
go
please
even
do.
slower.
Yes,
I'll go
I
slower,
need you to
Rachel. Sorry.
I need you to tilt the camera down a little bit because now we can't see the bottom of your face. Yes, this is brilliant. Please speak
Okay.
slower. Please use punctuation. Remember
Okay.
to stop and pause between your sentences. Take deep breaths for interpreters. I'm really, really sorry.
No problem. Thanks so much. And sorry, all the interpreters. I'll try to go even slower. But before we go to them, let me just say a few words how you can participate in the event. Please share your views in the chat and let's make this conversation vibrant. We have 6 presenters today. We'll divide the session into 2 parts. We'll have 3 presenters first and then break out for a discussion Q&A. So please share your questions, comments in the chat and we'll bring that in after the first 3 presenters. We will then go to the second session and follow the similar pattern. And so let's move on to, can I invite the first presenter, Yokling Chi from Third World Network. Yokeling will look at how current trade and investment rules impact every sector of country's economic and social fabric and often results in deepening structural inequalities which disproportionately impacts women and girls. The neoliberal rules in the package of treaties administered by World Trade Organization with its enforcement does lead to economic extractivism beyond traditional trade in goods and services. When more liberalization was resisted by the South, we saw a proliferation of bilateral and regional free trade agreements and economic partnerships that have several threats. Let's invite Yoklin and let's hear what are the impacts of such trade and investments on national domestic policies and their impact on women and girls. Yoklin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Priti, and thank you to everyone who worked so hard for this. I'm very proud as a board member of EURO to see this really fabulous series that was launched yesterday. So I'm going to actually perhaps just set some parameters of some of the broader issues around economic justice that we're all working with from different angles. As Priti was saying in the introduction, we are looking at financing in this series, in this particular discussion, but we have a history in the South, a history where natural resources have been extracted during the colonial period, continue to be extracted even after independence. And we see the value added in terms of our resources going into the global supply chain and then becoming products. And the value added is always in the consumption countries. So we see deep inequality, not just in terms of wealth distribution, but also in terms of the value that we can retain from our resources. So even a country that may be diversified away from just producing commodities in agriculture, and then you think you're very diversified because you have manufacturing of electronic parts or some computer parts, but in the global supply chain, if you are buying intermediate goods, let's say from China in Southeast Asia, and then we do certain parts to it, and then we send the parts back to China, they assemble it into the final product, and then they export it to the United States. So we in the Southeast Asian countries are essentially actually working a commodity equivalent kind of a global supply chain where we are. So we don't have the real value added in all our factories, where we bring in lots of labor, usually from the rural areas, and mostly women in many of these sectors. And even China, there was a very good study done that showed for every dollar in China and every dollar in the United States, the value added, the earnings from that dollar is much higher in the United States than it is even in China. Because China also, in its first era of manufacturing, was very much using cheap labor, huge scale of production, therefore cheap prices, and that fueled a lot of consumption, but the final value added really is at the retail and the final end in the United States, for example. And of course, in the shipping, in global trade, the freight, the shipping, the aircraft that bring all these goods up and down everywhere, it's very dominated, again, by corporations that are predominantly that in the North. So what we see really is a very deep-seated structural extractivism, okay? And this extractivism is actually also depriving us in the South of the ability to mobilize our own financial resources when we use our own resources, when our labor actually in our society put themselves to produce things. And of course, there is a question of whether we are even doing it sustainably or not. So a lot of this production has actually created resource loss, environmental pollution, displacements of communities in the rural areas. So the cost has been very high, and the mobilizing of domestic resources have actually not been as much as we could have gotten. And of course, there's tax evasion, tax avoidance, all the things that many of us are familiar with. So what I want to focus on in the next few minutes really is that given this structural injustice that gets compounded by trade rules, investment rules, economic rules, we see in the WTO a very interesting thing. When in the mid-90s, when the World Trade Organization was set up to implement and administer a whole bunch of agreements that are not really trade agreements, we shouldn't even call it World Trade Organization, because they deal with services, they deal with certain aspects of investment, and very importantly, introduce for the first time a global treaty on intellectual property that we didn't have before 1995. And this created really very deep legal structures that create monopolies, that increase the rights of corporations. But because of civil society pushback, protests around all the early days of the WTO ministerial meetings, and then we see developing country governments, including the least developed country governments, coordinating themselves. And a lot of that coordination of our governments came because of the national fights of women's movement, of farmers coming together, of SMEs, small and medium-sized businesses, saying that we will be squeezed out and we will be destroyed and there will be no livelihoods if we open our doors to foreign corporations, foreign banks, foreign service providers, without thinking about how we must have policies that protect domestic well-being, domestic production, and create jobs and distribute wealth in our own countries. So we see a pushback and attempts to have more and more sort of new agreements in the WTO, including a full-fledged investment agreement. What the developed countries have failed for a long, long time is to get a Bill of Rights called an investment agreement that will really just deregulate a country's investment policies and allow foreign entities to come in, take the money out when they want, and with no conditions on them. And
you have 1 minute.
Okay, so what we have found is that this proliferation of free trade agreements, bilateral with the United States, with the EU, or within regional agreements, trans-Pacific, you name it, they're all 20, 25 chapters. Everything in your country is subject to liberalization. Government procurement, your state-owned enterprises, everything. And we have found that foreign ownership of many of our economies have gone up in the last 10 to 20 years. So we have lost national space. We have increased a lot of inputs and imports into our country, often at the disadvantage of our local farmers and small businesses. So then what we see in COVID is that we have another round of accumulation of debt. Already we have huge debt burden, and lots of that has been discussed. And we have a new round of borrowing because of COVID. And many of these IMF loans are coming with austerity measures, the same old, same old, same old. So we expect to see a big spike in debt at a time when for many years, UNCTAD, civil society, even governments have been calling strongly for a global mechanism to deal with sovereign debt, which have been many times illegally or unfairly accumulated. And that we are going to have more discussion on. And it is worrisome that political will, when it's there, can mobilize trillions. The developed countries, the OECD has mobilized trillions in the last months and printed money in the United States to deal with COVID crisis in their own countries. But there is a trail of broken promises for the financial resources that historically and because of inequitable structures are owed to us in the South. And this is something that needs major transformation and reform. Do we have the courage to do so in an era of COVID and lockdown? Maybe this is the moment. The fact that the BRIC country, South Africa, another BRIC country, India, has gone to the WTO,
can you end?
And said we want a temporary waiver of all implementation of intellectual property for COVID products is a sign that there may be hope. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Sorry, Yoklin, for cutting you, but you have given a very good segue to our next speaker, Shubha Chako. Shubha is a member of BRICS Feminist Watch and heads Solidarity Foundation in India. As Yoklin pointed out, during the pandemic, this is a distressing period and many countries are heavily leaning on IFIs to help them out to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And this becomes a double crisis of health and economy, which many countries therefore are turning to IFIs for support. IFIs like IMF, World Bank are, however, even at this crisis time, as Yoklin pointed out, pushing policies, lending conditionalities that feminists have long argued are detrimental to countries, especially in context of their human rights and gender equality obligation. Shubha in her presentation is particularly going to look at the case in India. What are the responses from IFI to COVID crisis to India? And what is their approach to the recovery process? What are the kinds of projects that they are funding? And what are the implications from a gender justice feminist perspective to this? And what's the way forward to build back a better way forward? So Shubha, you have the floor now.
Thank you, everybody, for having me here. And I'm delighted to be part of this panel. Thank you also to everyone for making this happen, at the IVROP team and everybody else. So even as I speak, India is witnessing one of the biggest uprising of farmers ever. And the farmers have been protesting in the capital, Delhi, because of some of the new laws that have been passed, which is going to further cripple uh, a sector which, even though it is supposedly it is the backbone of this country, has been wronged time and again. So I speak with that happening right now in Delhi, and that the government had passed these bills even while COVID and the pandemic is raging still in the country. Okay, so if you look at, of course, what has been happening with the COVID and the lockdown that was imposed in India, of course, the fallout has been terrible on people at who have at it showed up the fault lines in the country, and those who've been disadvantaged were further pushed into poverty, homelessness, social exclusion has increased, inequality has multiplied. So this is the background. So what happens to women then? So of course, as we know, that poverty affects women more than men. So poverty rates have been predicted to go up for women. Hunger in a country where malnutrition is already very high uh, is is uh, is going to is skyrocketing. We've seen indebtedness growing, and again here, women have very few assets, so they're selling whatever little they have and taking loans at very, at very astronomically high interest rates. Employment and livelihood has suffered, especially in the informal sector where most women are present, and violence against women has increased, and against children. I mean, for example, a study shows that internet searches on child sexual abuse related content jumped by some 90% during this time. Um, of course, other issues that came up were healthcare, both in terms of access to healthcare not being possible, and access for women for any kind of sexual and reproductive health care being pushed away, saying that it is not essential health care, including abortions. And also education has come to a standstill, and inequality has grown, because if classes are moving online, then what happens to children from a certain socioeconomic background, including girls, who then early marriages have begun to rise. So the spill out and fallout of this has been tremendous on women. One of the pictures, of course, of the COVID and the lockdown that was of thousands of migrants, millions. We said the number is around 40 million migrants who have been affected due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And here again, women are, more invisibilized, because one thinks of migrants as men. And also that when the migrant men did return, it has also affected social relations in the villages that they've come to.
Shubha, you have 1 minute to wrap up.
Oh my God. Sorry. So then, if I'm sorry, if I come quickly to the IFIs.
Yeah, please, if you can.
Yeah, the responses have been very much, to stuck with the traditional thing of looking at direct transfer of resources, and also the direct transfer of benefits, and also basic health and basic issues around health. And what we find is that it is still stereotypical ideas of women to do cooking, to do cleaning, and that kind of like, for example, giving them gas, gas reduction on gas, LPG, etc., or other views of looking at self-help groups in a very instrumentalist point of view. Gender indicators are completely missing from the picture. Women are not counted as workers. and therefore their portability of rights is not there. They're not involved in decision making, so there is, it is still largely led by men, and the overemphasis on technology as a way to deliver benefits again disadvantages women who don't have as much access to technology and and banking services. And all of this, there's a push for privatization of services, even though the pandemic has clearly told us for the need of a robust public health services. And the IFIs have been supporting these kind of projects where they have even allowed for this greater privatization and very little participation. Forget participation. There's very little even information on what kind of have they done any kind of gender analysis? Is there any idea of what kind of impact it would have? There is very little information to judge them on, and it is also, as I said, pushing for privatization, and participation is discouraged. Participation of civil society or
Shubha, if you can end.
Yes. So I will just end with saying that if the recommendations for the way forward would be to think of doing a rapid gender analysis of the impact and the interventions, of mapping the risks, of addressing all forms of gender-based violence, of looking at social protection and other measures in a more gender-sensitive manner, inclusion of women and other marginalized communities in all decision-making, and following principles of human rights, including the human rights impact assessment of economic reforms, which was voted by the United Nations.
Thanks so much. I'm sure you can add when we open up for discussion, Shubha. I'm sorry to interrupt you and cut you short. We will move on after Shubha. We will go to Patricia Chavez from Brazil. Patricia is a co-founder of Feminist Land Platform and also heads Espaço Feminista. Patricia, in her presentation, will talk about development finance and its impacts on women's land and territorial rights in Latin America, especially in Brazil. She will give us an overview of IFI and corporate interests in Latin American region and how this interest compromises national sovereignty, the challenges connected to this, and how women's organizations and feminist movements are resisting and challenging these neo-colonial policies and practices in the region. Patricia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I will be speaking in Portuguese, my language. So I'm switching for the Portuguese translator. Então, agora estou falando em português, vocês podem me ouvir. Primeiro, eu gostaria de dizer que vou começar de baixo para cima. Eu vou começar trazendo um exemplo muito claro de como a desigualdade de gênero na propriedade, da posse da terra e no fornecimento e acesso à água, acesso ao saneamento e à moradia digna perpassou os vários governos e as várias políticas macroeconômicas e que persiste em tempos de desenvolvimento sustentável. Então, a pergunta que nós fazemos é: desenvolvimento sustentável para quem? Eu vou iniciar e discordar, assim, mudar um pouco o cunho da apresentação, iniciando pelo caso da Zona da Mata Norte, no estado de Pernambuco, Brasil, onde foi feito um imenso investimento público pelos governos do estado de Pernambuco e também pelo governo federal, entre os anos de 2012 e 2015, com a construção de toda a infraestrutura necessária para atrair o capital financeiro internacional que investiria na região e transformaria a vida da população de uma região que foi secularmente oprimida e explorada pela monocultura da cana-de-açúcar. Essa era a promessa que o capital financeiro internacional chegaria finalmente à nossa região para nos libertar de séculos de exploração. Quando analisamos e comparamos os dados dos censos agropecuários, que nós temos censos agropecuários, entre 2006 e 2007, para essa mesma região e população, vemos que o que aconteceu, e analisando os resultados obtidos com os dados desagregados por gênero, classe, raça e outras categorias, vemos, e também utilizando o censo demográfico, nos deparamos com uma situação muito diferente. E é isso que eu quero focar. No caso da Zona da Mata Norte, a conclusão é triste, pois constatamos que a desapropriação de alguns milhares de hectares de terra para permitir a construção de fábricas moderníssimas, fábricas estrangeiras, moderníssimas, da indústria automobilística, de hemoderivados e de produção de bebidas, acabou se transformando ou trazendo maior precariedade na vida de todas as mulheres. Então, constatamos que o preço da terra subiu enormemente, o que causou uma redução drástica no tamanho das parcelas de terra sob o controle das mulheres, além do aumento do preço das terras ter literalmente obrigado as famílias a venderem suas parcelas. Analisando coletivamente os dados, e quando eu digo coletivamente os dados, eu digo com todos os grupos de mulheres, e eu vou especificar, certo? O que observamos é que houve uma redução no acesso aos serviços públicos, mesmo com o aumento do PIB municipal e da arrecadação de impostos, tudo demonstrado através de gráficos com dados produzidos pelo Instituto Brasileiro de Geografia e Estatística, o IBGE. O que os gráficos e os grupos de discussão nos informam é que houve um aumento da poluição dos rios e dos mangues, redução da oferta de água e até mesmo as mulheres beneficiadas pelo programa de reforma agrária do governo federal foram obrigadas a arrendar suas terras para a produção de cana-de-açúcar. Que ironia! Entendemos que os empregos seguros e bem remunerados não eram para as mulheres com baixa escolaridade e nem serão para as suas filhas, se não houver um investimento em educação e saúde, em transporte e moradia. Os dados que empoderam e o mito do desenvolvimento sustentável. O caso da Zona da Mata Norte não é diferente da situação das mulheres na região do Agreste de Pernambuco, uma outra região onde realizamos uma pesquisa com dados secundários e realizamos também uma pesquisa de coleta de dados primários, onde as próprias mulheres coletaram e analisaram esses dados. Quando o discurso se desmantela, fica a consciência da realidade dura e cruel de todas essas mulheres. Mas entendemos o que é preciso e...
Patricia, you have 1 minute.
Oh, my God. Ok. Então, o que eu gostaria, nesse 1 minuto, de colocar é que o que acontece na Zona da Mata Norte, o que acontece no Agreste, não é uma situação isolada. Nós vivemos numa região em disputa. A região da América Latina é uma das maiores produtoras de commodities que são vendidas em bolsas de valores e por várias safras. Constatamos que nossas terras estão sendo vendidas para os investidores internacionais e também para fundos de pensão de professores de universidade dos Estados Unidos. Então, temos uma dimensão do tamanho do problema da nossa região, certo? Por ser tão rica em minérios, ter a maior reserva de lítio, por exemplo, do mundo, na Bolívia, certo? Ser uma das maiores produtoras de petróleo, como é o caso da Venezuela, certo? E também deter, e isso é muito importante, uma das maiores reservas de água doce do mundo e com a grande capacidade de reposição de suas águas subterrâneas e, claro, com a água que vem toda a diversidade. E aí nós entendemos que a Amazônia, além do nosso Pantanal, representam essa riqueza e que ela está sendo destruída e apropriada por países do norte, especialmente os Estados Unidos, que montaram, não por acaso, bases militares em torno de um dos maiores reservas de água subterrânea, água doce subterrânea, que é o aquífero Guarani. Entendemos por que tanta floresta está sendo destruída, tantas famílias tendo de vender suas terras por conta da violência e da grilagem, comunidades indígenas inteiras sendo destruídas pelo fogo na Amazônia, no Pantanal, e muitas vezes a terra ficam até vazias, pois viram mercadorias e são vendidas em mercados futuros. O que eu gostaria de concluir, certo? E gostaria de apresentar mais dados, se for provocada, é que nossos direitos básicos e fundamentais estão sendo usurpados e agora com a pandemia os governos aproveitam
Patricia,
a crise.
can you end? Patricia,
Yes.
can you please end?
Só que os governos estão aproveitando a crise para desregulamentar as leis que deveriam nos proteger e garantiriam os nossos direitos. O Estado que deveria nos proteger, honrando com nossa Constituição e as leis que dizem que garante que todos os cidadãos são iguais, eles estão, na prática, autorizando a exploração dos nossos recursos minerais e nossa biodiversidade em favor dos países do norte. Muito obrigada.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Really important how our governments are equally responsible for exploiting our natural resources and our people, and work in favor of North interest as opposed to working in our interest. This very well ties up to what Yoklin was raising too. I would invite Sibulele to help us with the discussion. We have 10-15 minutes. I see some of you are sharing your thoughts on the chat. Sibulele, are you there? Do you want to come in and lead the discussion here?
Yes, I'm here, Pretty. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hello, everybody. I'd like to take this opportunity to greet you from the most south of Africa, South Africa. I'm going to be moderating this session in terms of questions and answers. A lot of you have engaged in the box, and I'd like to take, perhaps, let's take 3 hands. Let's take 4 rounds of 3 hands at a time, and then you can introduce yourself within 10 seconds and then go ahead and ask the question. May I please ask the facilitator to assist me in terms of pointing out who is asking each question, and then I'll take it from there. So we're going to take 4 rounds of 3 questions at a time. Let's go. Does anybody have a question?
Sibu, it's Preeti. In interest of time, can you pull out the comments and questions from the chat? We will not have time to give speaking time to participants. If you can please pull out the comments and questions from the chat.
I've lost you. I didn't hear that, Pretty.
What I'm saying, can you hear me now?
Yes, I
Sibu?
can hear you in the interest of time.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
what I'm
I can
saying
hear
is
you.
that can you pull out, please pull out. We will not have time to give for participants to speak, but if you can pull out the questions and comments from the chat and share it with the panelists to respond to them.
All right, let's start with the first question. The first question goes to SB on other roles of WTO. First, the agreements that are administered at the WTO deal with good trade. That means tariff removal, services, liberalization, anything that is not good. Intellectual property is not goods, like intellectual property requires requiring a minimum of 20 years on all qualifying products and technology, seeds, microorganisms, etc., investment facilitation. Negotiations are good on now, on e-commerce disciplines, on domestic regulations. That looks like a comment, but won't SB please elaborate on that? It comes from Yokeling.
So,
And it's actually everyone. So anybody
Sibu, can you just pull out
one.
2-3? Can you pull out 2-3 comments and all, and then I will give it to each panelist to respond. So one is on WTO. One was a question on, if I may just, if you'll allow me to.
I've got it, Pretty. The first one is a comment to SB, but it goes to everyone who would like to respond. But with it from Yokeling, it's on WTO. So anyone of the panelists can engage on this question. The second question, it goes to Yoke as well. It's from Cressida Kaula from PNG, who is really intrigued by the last phrase about a legal waiver. Please, can you elaborate on this waiver for a minute or two if we have time here? Yes, so won't you please, Yoke, engage on Cressida Kaula's question? And let's take those two questions first and then see how we go.
Yokelin, unmute, please.
Sorry. To save time, I actually typed the response to the two questions. I think the first one was about what else does the WTO do? I think the first thing we need to understand is that the WTO is not, like I said, dealing only with goods. It deals with many aspects of our national economy, and they set rules because once the governments have negotiated those agreements, and when WTO was set up, there were a few of these agreements already as a package. And then since then, there have been attempts to even have more new rules. And these rules basically take away a lot of policy space at the national level. And they do one thing, they open up your national economy for foreign entities to come into your country with very little regulation. So I think that's been the big problem. And they have an enforcement mechanism. However, at the moment, because why do we have so many free trade agreements or economic partnerships, like with the US or with EU, bilateral, like between Kenya and the EU or ASEAN countries in our region, with the US and all that kind of stuff. And all that's because the WTO system being really more multilateral, you can resist. Without consensus, nobody can start a new negotiation. And that's why for the last 10, 15 years, there's been a big growth of all these so-called trade agreements, which are not just about goods. There are also 20 to 25 chapters on everything in your society. Quickly on the waiver, and of course, the other thing, of course, is these trade agreements, unlike the WTO, which is that's bad by comparison, these free trade agreements give the right often to the company to directly sue a government in secret private arbitration, not in your courts, yeah? And this is actually very dangerous for investors suing for billions of dollars from a government. That's really taking a lot of resources out of your hands. Quickly on the waiver, I've also given a link to Third World Network's website, where we have all the documents of the WTO discussion. There's a huge groundswell of public support all over the world. I think Avas did 900,000 individuals sign on to a petition that was sent to the WTO members last week, calling for this waiver. In the WTO system, any country can actually put in a request that there is a waiver or a suspension of any of the agreements to be implemented if the situation requires it. And you have to negotiate and get all the members of the WTO to agree. So what South Africa and India did was precisely to do something for intellectual property, suspend it so we can scale up production and make sure people have access to masks and vaccines and all these medicines which are otherwise going to be patented.
Thank you. Let's get to the next question. The next question is coming from Siobhan Booth, who says, with BRICS emerging as a challenge to traditional Western-backed international financial institutions, what is to say that the bloc will advocate for the support of women's rights within its activities? For example, with Chinese using forced labor. And the next question comes from Audrey Lee from ERO. Is the accountability agenda with BRICS different from the one related to IFIs in general? Is there an ideological difference or system difference that we need to know as human rights activists? Okay, I'm going to give each speaker 1 minute each, if you may, 1 or 2 minutes each, if you may. Respond quickly so we can get on to the other questions.
Shubha, did you want to take, you or Patricia, do you want to take this, or did you want me to respond to it?
You can respond to it, Priti,
I think so.
especially on the BRICS, and then maybe Shubha can continue from you or Patricia.
So it is true that in ideology, BRICS emerged and gave us hope that it would be this amazing South bloc, which will question the Western-backed international financial institutes as well as function in a different way. But we are disappointed to see that they follow this pretty much similar. They play lip service to South-South cooperation, but in the larger scheme of things, they are one of the most non-transparent and not a space which has opened up for civil society or women engagement and participation in that way. In the second section of today's panel, we'll have Sibu, who will present and share with us how BRICS Feminist Watch has used the BRICS space and has found it challenging, so that you might find it useful. In terms of accountability, we find the same challenge, it not being a transparent space. Even if you look at BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank, it's one of the most non-transparent bank, doesn't disclose anything, and it becomes that much difficult for us to engage. In such a scenario, there is really no commitment to women's rights or gender equality. In the entire strategy document of the New Development Bank, which they adopted in 2017, the word women and gender was not even included. It was a 3-year strategy plan. So, and they don't have a gender expert or a gender unit, and they work in a very gender neutral way, which has been a BRICS Feminist Watch advocacy agenda. So I will let others to talk about it if they want to. Thanks, Ibulele.
I just want to add one line, and then I think in the interest of time, we can go to the others. Just wanted to say that the environment and social framework that they have, that the NDB has, is also very weak.
And I just like to add that from Brazil, you cannot expect anything good from these BRICS, investments, really. With the government that we have, don't expect anything like transparency, accountability from the investments.
Maybe
Thanks so much, colleagues.
Yeah, can I just quickly add, Sibu?
Yes.
I think that we have to be very clear that all these, the thinking is very conventional neoliberal, infrastructure, business. There may be some slight difference, but fundamentally it's the same kind of development thinking. So, and even if they put in a little program here and there on gender, if the basic structure and framework of these banks are the same old, then we actually will have the very deep-seated structural discrimination and exploitation of women. So I think that we need to really look at the whole assumption and construct and principles if we really want to have change.
Yes, thank you so much for that. There's also a comment from Shubha that you've just made around environmental and social framework in the NDB, our New Development Bank, that is very weak. I think maybe as we entertain the links that are provided in the chat box, colleagues, let's also have a look out at how weak these social and environmental safeguards are. But if we go back to the WTO, there's a question that came a little bit earlier, which looked at what other roles did the WTO play that deal with just trade deals. Perhaps that came from Siobhan Booth. and perhaps we could engage with that question. And if there is another question, maybe somebody can engage on that. Just 1 minute, if anybody would like to engage on that. We've been alerted that it's time now for us to go to the next session. But perhaps if we could just ask this question around, are there any other roles that the WTO has played in terms of trade deals? Shuba, Patricia, or you, Pretty, would you like to have 30 seconds on that?
Maybe Yoklin, do you want to respond to the role
No,
of WTO?
I think we've answered that. I think Siobhan just,
yeah,
I did just now, yeah.
Well done. Okay, then let's go to the next session. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ibu. So thank you everyone for your comments and questions. We will go to the second session, and we have 3 presenters in this session also. We start with Mariama Williams. Mariama is from Jamaica and is based in Geneva at the South Center. Mariama today will present on South-South cooperation in context of climate and sustainable finance and its impact on gender. She will briefly cover the conceptual debates around climate and sustainable finance, and she will help us locate South-South finance within this and explore how this helps shape the landscape for women's empowerment and gender equality. Mariama, you have the floor.
Yes, I need my camera to be released. Hello. Hi. Okay, great. So good morning, afternoon, evening, good night, everyone. Thank you very much for your participation in this panel. And I thank my fellow speakers who have done an amazing job of delivering this, the content. And I hope to be able to come in a little bit. So my task is to talk a little bit about broadly what's called sustainable finance, going down to the detail nitty-gritty of climate finance. There's a lot of terms that are being used now. We talk about green finance, sustainable climate finance. Sometimes they're used synonymously, but there are also some substantive differences between them. So if we could start and have a framework that we're really talking broadly about sustainable finance, right? Which is the financing that will finance sustainable development and the 2030 agenda, including the SDG goals. And if you remember, the SDG goals are 13 with a whole number of targets and so forth. But within the 13 is climate. Within the SDG goals, goal 13 is climate, right? And all of the rest of the goals relate to climate and relate to environment and are impacted by trade and all of the various issues that we're talking about. So I want to talk a little bit about how the sustainable financing gets done and dovetailing to climate finance. It's a lot of conceptual discussions about what is finance, what is green, what is climate. And I must say that climate finance, of all the different finance there's only one pool of money that's available. Even with the Addis Ababa agenda, we have a lot of discussion, a lot of talk, and that is climate finance. And so there's a lot of jockeying, both by big banks, little banks, middle banks, World Bank, the World Bank, UNEP, UNDP, all the UN agencies are jockeying for climate finance because it is the legitimate pool of money that exists. So a lot of definition about what is climate finance. There's very much a lot of debate. It has not been defined within the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention, where climate finance originated. There is a sense in which we accept, those of us who work with developing country, Article 4 and Article 4.5, that says climate finance should be flexible, available, affordable. It should not be lead to diversion of ODA, and it should be available in a way that allow developing countries to undertake their climate action. But there's a lot of leakages and bleeding through of climate finance into quote unquote green finance, into other areas. On the table is the promise of $100 billion per year by 2020, which the Paris Agreement have extended to 2025 for developing countries. And this is to undertake climate actions, adaptation, mitigation in developing countries. We could go through many different things to talk about whether or not it's sufficient or not, but that's the money that's promised on the table. We have no other promise about money. There's big push for the private sector, but most of that private sector is supposed to be leveraged out of this $100 billion. Now there's a big debate about whether it's 100 from the reading of the agreement in the Cancun agreement, it's $100 billion per year by 2020. But if you look at any of the developed country report, they're accumulating it and thinking that it's by 2020 should have 100. But the agreement said $100 billion by 2020. Every year or so, or even 18 months or so, the OECD and the developed countries report on how much of that $1 billion have been contributed. This year, the OECD reported at about 78 billion. So that means they think they're 13 billion away from achieving $100 billion. But what's important is what is the public climate finance of it. Because the public climate finance is what many developing countries, especially poor developing countries who have very limited resource due to issues around climate and debt and trade and debt and so forth, and now COVID. So that's about 62 billion. But many of us who look at the figures, and in particular, Oxfam has done a very good job looking at the figure, so we can test that figure to say, what is the climate finance? And even if you accept the figure, 40% of it is loans, which really negate the principle of polluters pay and the whole principle of climate justice and equity, which is underlying the UNFCCC. So climate finance is a contested area, but it's still the area that has money on the table. Part of that money, about $10 billion now, is allocated to the Green Climate Fund. And the Green Climate Fund is where countries are putting in their projects for all of their climate action.
I'm really sorry to interrupt you. This is Rachel. Please speak a little bit slower. Please pause between your sentences. We need the Nepalese signed interpreters to be able to keep up, as well as interpreters to be able to translate effectively, because you're involving data and numbers. I'm really, really sorry.
But I don't want people to get, I'm putting the numbers out, so for reference, but the numbers do not get tied to the numbers, just a reference to say that this is the money
but the
that
interpreters
exists.
need to interpret what you are saying.
Yes,
so
yes, but
help
I'm
them by speaking slower. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please
I
pause
will
between your
speak
sentences.
slower.
Thank you.
And I do apologize to the interpreter, but I want the audience to not be tied up with the numbers. The numbers are reference. I'm an economist, so I use numbers. What I want you to get an idea is that we have different ways of referring to finance that's supposed to be for sustainable development. But in that context, the only part of available money that's on the table is $100 billion that's been promised by developed countries. And the expectation is that much of that should have been grant money that would enable developing countries, particularly LDC, SIDS, and African countries, and those in Asia who are part of the category who cannot finance, right? And now what we have, in addition to the leakage of that money, climate finance money, into green finance, sustainable finance, and a whole bunch of things, plus the fact that that money is now supposed to be leveraging the private sector, that means that developing countries will have less and less of it, which means that in the context of where we are now with COVID and the rise in debt crisis that COVID is generating, as countries have to make themselves available, and they have to try to have access to cheap credit. So more and more of them are getting into debt. Many of our countries have gone back to the IMF, and we know that that comes with a whole bunch of conditionality and caveats that are not useful for women, as all of the financial crises that have occurred, including the 2007-2008 financial crisis.
Mariama, you have 1 minute.
Okay, so I wanted to flag for people that, you know, the South-South cooperation are initiatives that developing countries are sharing amongst themselves. And it's not just the BRICS. Even small countries are sharing resources among themselves in Latin America, in Asia. Of course, the BRICS and the New Development Bank and the AIB, the Infrastructure Bank, are getting the big play. And the BRICS, despite have committed to sustainable development. And China, through its South-South Fund, has put $1 billion to South-South Assistance Fund. And a lot of that money is going for climate change. Indonesia and other countries are also doing technical assistance and other kinds of in-kind contribution around adaptation, sharing knowledge, sharing tools, and so forth. Now, where does women come in? Women, of course, are highly impacted by climate change and climate risk in all of our dimensionalities, whether we're head of household, MSME, farmers, whether we're indigenous women or women living with disability. Adaptation and climate risk and loss and damage are critically important to us for both for gender equality issues and women's empowerment. So there's been a lot of push by feminists and gender advocates to bring gender into these funds, the climate funds I'm talking about, so that gender policy and gender action plans guide the distribution of the funds. I cannot at this moment tell you how much percentage of funds are going to women's project and women's organization on the ground, because the transparency around this is not there. We talk about transparency about the BRICS and so forth, but the transparency in UNDP, in World Bank, in all of these entities that are international entities that are ministering the fund, especially from GCF and what called the Climate Investment Fund, when it comes to gender, among other things, are not clear. What we know for sure is adaptation is 25% of the fund. And adaptation is where many developing countries in Africa and Asia are having to respond to climate events, floods and so forth, and that women on the ground, of course, suffer the most because of their responsibility for care. But we don't have anywhere any figure tracking. The OECD DAC will tell you that they're tracking ODA and they track quote unquote climate relevant funds, but we don't have a really good sense of the specific funds coming out of climate through the UNFCCC, where that money is going relative to women. And so a lot of transparency is required, a lot of coherence around looking at these issues are required. And I will stop there and take some questions and answer in the second part of this event.
Thanks so much, Mariama. A lot to think about. And, as number one, the commitment to funds is not there, and what is there is leaking, and then there is no transparency to how do you hold accountability and how do you monitor. We will move on to the next speaker, and we will go deeper at a country level. Devi Pushpa from Indonesia is our next speaker. She works with AXI for Gender, Social and Ecological Justice. She is also on the board of NGO Forum on ADB. Like many South governments, Government of Indonesia has publicly expressed its commitment to reducing greenhouse emission by 2025. They have developed a national action plan which was developed to reduce the greenhouse gas, but has been developed without consulting or discussing it with people. So Devi and her team has done an extensive study on women and energy in Indonesia. They collected women's stories from 5 energy project sites. And in her presentation, Devi today will share her findings from this study and provide analysis regarding women's experience with large energy projects such as geothermal, wind farm, and hydropower. Devi, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Preeti. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, good night, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to share with all of you our result study about the energy, women's and energy in Indonesia. So before I present my presentation, I would like to share the short video. This is about the testimony of the women regarding the geothermal project in Indonesia. Hopefully this is fine. Okay, I will share screen. Okay, so this clear?
Yes, Devi, we can see it. Please go ahead. Devi, does the video have an audio also? We can't hear the audio of the video, or is it just visual?
Sorry. This is have the audio. You cannot hear.
We can't hear the audio of the video.
Okay.
We can hear you. We can hear you, but we can't hear the video audio.
Okay. So okay, maybe I can stop the video. But actually, the video this is about the testimony of the women regarding the geothermal impact of the geothermal project in the Mount Slamet. So you can see actually have the water pollution. So and this is also impact for the home industry in that village. So I'm very sorry because the audio is not clear, so you cannot hear what this is the video. But actually, I already share with Priti. Maybe Priti can also share with all of you this short video. So I can continue with my presentation because the limit of time. Yeah, I hope this presentation I can finish less than 5 minutes, but I'm not sure. Okay. So this is the short presentation about the energy project in Indonesia. Actually, we like Priti say that aksi for gender social ecological justice. We have a feminist participatory action research conducted by aksi, and the area this about the project energy is like the geothermal, hydropower, and wind, and also the we can see the linkage with the IFI. So sorry, I can share this. Okay, can I share this presentation, Priti? Okay, so
Devi, you have two more minutes.
Yeah?
If you can make
Okay.
your points in 2 minutes.
Yeah. I will go fast. So this is the Indonesian government response for the climate change. So one of the sector, the main target for the reduced emission is in the energy sector, and particular in the geothermal project. Yeah. So this is what the Ministry of Energy in Indonesia already designed 3,024 geothermal area. So the mostly on the geothermal area is the mostly on the active volcanoes with the many occurrence of the eruption and earthquake since Indonesia line on the ring of fire. And the other 70% of the geothermal site is inside of the mountainous protect forest source of the water for millions people. So this is the site. So you can see all area in Indonesia. Our government they have the plan to build the geothermal plant, and this is also the map of the hydropower energy in Indonesia. You can also one of the area in the central Sulawesi, which is one of the site our research with the women's in community. So the video about the geothermal, we can see the impact how the pollution of the water make the multi-burden for the women, because they must to found the clean water. They must to walk around 2 kilometers to found the clean water for their cooking, bathing, and so on. And the other,
if you have 1 minute, if you can wind up.
Okay. And this is about the women's experience in the hydropower plants in the central Sulawesi by Poso Energy Company. And you can see the impact. There is no clear irrigation information about the impact of the hydropower project, no consultation, concern, particular for the women. The land acquisition process was not carried out through discussion and agreement about the land price. And yeah, the happening about the land grabbing, eviction, lack of the access to water resource. And of course, this is also impact for the loss of their income and livelihood. And the other problems, the Poso River pollution become muddy and brownish color. So the Poso River cannot used by communities anymore. However, the communities are forced to use the dirty and polluted river water since they cannot afford to buy water every day for cooking, drinking, bathing, and so on. Conflict horizontal happening, intimidation happening, and also this is increasing gender injustice. And that's the conclusion. So we found that the big scale project come with the determination to be built at any cost. This aggression trigger land and resource grabbing, forced displacement, loss of the livelihood, environmental pollution, and also destruction and improvement of the communities, particularly for the women. And the arrogance of the big scale project, this is also ignores human and women's rights. Women's human rights. So we can found in the big scale project of the energy. This is become what is human right and women's right violation. So the other we see that the push of the economic
Devi, can you
transformation.
end,
However,
please? Devi, sorry to interrupt. Can you
yeah,
end, please?
actually, I think this is only the two bullet point again, because this is important. We see for the economic transformation and its transition to reduce emission and strengthening the resilience must put primacy on the sustainable of livelihood and life of the people, because this is not only about the how the clean energy or the response for the climate change, but the big issue how this is also can be sustainable for our life, particular for the women's rights. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Devi, and sorry to interrupt you. This was very interesting. I have few questions. I hope we'll have time to discuss it more detail. But in interest of time, I will go to our last speaker, Sibulele Poswayu from Inequality Movement and BRICS Feminist Watch in South Africa. Sibu was the coordinator of the Women's Working Group within Civil BRICS, and in her presentation, she will share how BRICS Feminist Watch and the Women's Movement have used this space within BRICS to organize. What are the challenges and what are the outcomes, and what's the way forward? Sibu, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Priti. I would just like to start with two quotes. As the chairwoman of the Inequality Movement, which is a movement in South Africa, but is a global movement and is a very active member of the BRICS Feminist Watch, I'd like to start with two quotes which highlight the high levels of inequality in South Africa, which is no different to the levels of inequality in the 5 countries of the BRICS formation. Most people's income and wealth levels are determined at birth. If you don't have the right start in life, adequate shelter and location, good quality health care and education, parents with well-paying jobs, then you are most likely to live in poverty. This is our reality in South Africa. And this is the reality in many, or with the exclusion of Russia, in many of the countries in the BRICS. So what we have found is this. As the Civil BRICS movement, we are a group of like-minded civil society organizations in the BRICS countries. We came together back in Fortaleza in 2013, when the Civil BRICS movement and the Civil BRICS formation, which is the third tier of the BRICS, the first tier being the leaders, the second being your BRICS think tank and your academic forums. The third track is Civil BRICS. Back in 2013, women from the BRICS countries came together and decided that it cannot be that we at any given point in time get to engage on issues that pertain to economic equality, cultural equality, socio-economic and political equality without taking the plight of women forward. So we met together in Fortaleza and we engaged the BRICS sous Sherpas. These are the leaders that within each country that engage and lead in the agenda of BRICS. So when we engage with these countries, with these organizations, with these sous Sherpas, we then came back, sorry, that was 2012. We came back in 2013 and it was the South African presidency. It was during this time when we in South Africa and in Brazil and China and India and Russia came together and said, we need to have a third track. And so it has been women from 2013 all the way to 2015 when the Civil BRICS was formalized in Russia. It was first formalized in Russia when in 2015, when women in these 5 countries said, we need to have the voice of the people in these structures. Unfortunately, it was more institutionalized than formalized. We wanted it to be unanimous. We wanted it to be
Excuse me, no sound, no sound. Sibuli.
Sibulele, I think you have not.
Economic emancipation for women. We push for all levels of engagement for women in these structures. Our success was then re-articulated in 2018 when these areas, and it was through the BRICS Feminist Watch where we pushed and actually led the state of engaging on women's issues. And so we decided to start by articulating recommendations that would, one, find translation in the leaders' declarations at the end of each BRICS session. And our success was two-pronged. The first element of success, I'll get to the challenges. The first element of success related to our demand that the civil society space should be autonomous. It should be formalized, similar to your BRICS business, similar to your BRICS research centers, similar to your leaders summit, but it should not be institutionalized. Because once you start institutionalizing it, the voice of the grassroots women will not find expression. But the beauty of formalizing it means.
Sibu, you have 1 minute if you can wind up.
Thanks, Pretty. We still have high levels of making sure that we determine the agenda. So let me highlight the 3 most successful recommendations. 1, we wanted an autonomous space for civil BRICS. It was done. 2, we wanted to ensure that women and women's business entities find
Sibu, we can't hear you. You're muted again. Sibu, we can't hear you. You're muted again. Can you unmute?
Was when we pushed for ensuring that the leaders start engaging on issues that relate to women's health, sexual reproduction, LGBTIQ issues were there. Unfortunately, we don't have what we wanted. We wanted a gender forum. We have the Women's Forum, but a strong and formidable woman in that space. We still push for rights of sexual rights for women, reproductive rights for young girls. We fight for low LGBTIQ, we fight for gender-based violence and femicide. But that we could have never done without the BRICS Feminist Watch, because it is through this formation of strong, formidable organizations within the BRICS to come together. And so we invite you to join our BRICS Feminist Watch in future, ensure that we have these strong voices, because we engage on the NDP. We've pushed for the new development bank to have a feminist bloc, a feminist expert, that we make sure that any level of projects that are funded, whether it's social infrastructure or hardcore infrastructure, should ensure that women are not displaced. One, women have their own public
Sibu,
participation.
I'm sorry to cut you off. Thanks so much. We lost your audio in the middle. If you don't mind, if you can type out your 3 recommendations, we couldn't hear it very clearly. You had 3 recommendations. People in the chat are asking for that. We have very little time. I don't know, Shubha, if you want to just quickly pull out 1 or 2 comments or questions from the chat.
People have asked many questions around, have asked for more information around climate funding. And I think on the chat, people have already provided links, so that has happened. Somebody has flagged the investor state dispute settlement provision and what that does, and and that there is a thing now to. Hello, sorry. Yeah, so there is a thing that we should on the investor state dispute settlement provisions, because to say that should we get companies, which allows companies to sue governments, and there is a move now to say that investors should also be come under the obligation of the International Investment Agreement. So there was some discussion around that. So those are the 2 main issues that have come up. Otherwise, there has been sharing of resources which people can look at. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shubha. I would invite the 3 panelists from this session, if they looking at the chat, or if there is something they would like to comment on, I would give each one of the panelists a minute to respond if they would want. So should we start with Mariama? Mariama, if you want to, is there something you want to respond or comment on?
Thank you, Priti. I have, there are some questions about resources. So I put a number of links, including WIDO has a nice gender web series on webinar on climate finance. The UNFCCC has some things. And if you're interested in following the negotiations, TWN puts on regular climate finance update or climate change updates, including discussions of that. For me, what's important is that we, each of us in our countries, advocate strongly with our national designated authority. So the Green Climate Fund, which is a fund that I mentioned, that is administering 10 billion of this fictional $100 billion that's floating around, is receiving proposals from country level and from everyone. And they've set up a mechanism called National Designated Authority, which in many cases is the Ministry of Environment, etc. in each country. And that entity lays between the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and the procurers of funds for projects on the ground. We haven't been so far successful in getting them to put a thematic window for gender, but we are asking people to get in touch, find out. If you go on the GCF website, it will tell you who your national designated authority is. It'll give you their names, their phone numbers, their email. It will tell you how many projects are coming from your country. What are they financing? Who is financing it? Each project must put together a gender assessment. You can look at that. You can make your own rebuttal. Some of it is very perfunctory or old, based on old analysis. So you need to get in touch with your NDA and try to get them to start funding and get them to set up mechanism to fund women's organization locally. The GCF and many of the big entities, they won't do it because it's not cost effective. But certainly in each country, if women's group get together under 1 or 2 umbrella aggregate, they should be able to put themselves as entities through which they could then approach their national designated authority and begin to get the money that they could then pass through either as microenterprise or agriculture or farmers. That's the only way we're going to get money to women on the ground. Otherwise, the money will keep going to the big players.
Thanks, Mariama. Devi, did you want to take a minute and say last few words? And thank you for sharing your reports as well as the video in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, actually there is no a specific question, but I would like to say that this is when we talk about the development and also climate crisis, climate the issue, and also the IFI, because what we found that the projects or the agenda of the climate issue is delivered by international finance institution. It's like the geothermal or renewable energy issue. So this is the big mostly the project is the big scale project. So this is what is the impact, a big impact, particular for the women. So what we want for how the energy develop energy by democracies, how the energy can be useful, so not have more impact for the women's rights, and also for the environment, and of course this is linked with the local wisdom. So what we doing now, how the governments, they have the agenda, or they have the planning to develop the energy with it's not the big scale project, but how they are identify the source in Indonesia, but in the micro scale. So the women, the community can be participate, they can be controlling, they can be know what the benefit for them with the energy. So this is not only business as usual. This is not for the private sector, because we see the big scale project. This is a benefit for the private sector, for the and also have the involved military, involve the intimidation situation, something like that. So how this can be we can raise how the democracies, the full democracies can be also benefit for the women's rights. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Devi. Sibu, did you want to?
Yes.
1 minute, did you want to comment on something?
I'll just take 1 minute to discuss the 3 recommendations. The first one, we called on the new development bank as the BRICS Feminist Watch to have a gender expert who will ensure, 1, that all procurement processes that come from all requests for funding are gender sensitive. 2, all issues and all projects that seek to be at grassroots level, which is the case for all at community level, should ensure that women's rights are taken to the fore. 2, the second recommendation we came up with was to ensure that South Africa's darling recommendation around the vaccine center becomes a geographical space. South Africa called for a vaccine center to be in any of the countries. Well, they were specific, they wanted it in South Africa, but because BRICS works on consensus, it needs to be decided between all the countries. So that vaccine center needs to be geographic, because then Brazil requested that vaccine center to be virtual. What we want is a geographic center of vaccine.
Sibu, we need to end.
Okay, and the third recommendation, we called for a BRICS Women's Forum, agenda forum. What we did get was the BRICS Women's Forum, which is okay. For now, it's a low-hanging fruit, but we're still calling for the gender forum to ensure that there are levels of sensitivity to all the LGBTIQ areas. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sibu. Rachel, do we have 1 minute, or do I have to end? I know I see the time is over for our panel. I wanted to thank...
no worries.
Can I take
ahead.
1 or 2 minutes? Is that
Yes,
okay?
yes, please go ahead.
So I
Thank
wanted
you.
to thank all the panelists. I know we were very ambitious and we casted a very wide net to bring in many issues as South feminist, how we unpack both at country level as well as engaging in global spaces, whether it's trade and investment or it's IFI, including the climate finance and sustainable finance, and how we monitor some of this. We heard from Patricia as well as Devi, the monitoring on the ground and the impact these large projects have on women's lives, livelihoods, and how women are being alienated from their livelihoods, land, resources, and they are not integrated in these large projects as development actors or economic agents in that way. However, what Sibulele shared also, there are a lot of organizing, even Yokling hinted to that how at national level, how feminist organizing, women movement organizing, farmers organizing are bringing pressure and challenging some of this, and how that is resulting in opening spaces and also allowing participation and engagement. Of course, we have a tough road ahead. It's not just that the challenges coming from the north, it's also our government and IFIs based in the south, as well as things that go on in our country become equally challenging. So I want to thank all of you who joined us, and I apologize for a bit of technical issues with time and cutting presenters off. We could hear them for a long time. And the lovely chat we are having. Thank you for your comments and all, and a big hug to all the ERA amazing team for putting such a fabulous forum together. Thanks so much, and we sign off from here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Stay safe. Stay safe.